Good morning, everyone. I think we'll get underway. Welcome. My name is Wally Hill. I'm CMA's Vice President of Government and Consumer Affairs, and I appreciate you all being here today. It's always encouraging for me to see a big turnout at one of our events where we're featuring a prominent member of the regulatory community, because that's an important part of the work we do as marketers. I'd like to thank the sponsors who helped to make today's event possible. All of them are important members of CMA, and we know they appreciate the importance of privacy protection in a data-driven world, and they understand the importance of supporting the kind of dialogue that we're having here today. So thank you to Bell Media, Rogers Communications, and TD Bank Group. So let me please introduce Doug Brooks, President and CEO of the Canadian Marketing Association, in order to more properly introduce our featured speaker. Doug.
Thanks, Wally. Good morning, everybody. You know, there's nothing as sexy as having a regulator in town, because we get these big crowds whenever this happens. So congratulations, first of all, for being here. Obviously, it's something that's very important to our marketing community. And I think, again, we share a common interest in protecting consumers and the public. That's why we're all here. That's why we all follow a code around ethical marketing and the business practices that you all employ. So really pleased to have you out with us this morning. Apologize, get a bit of a cold. Also want to acknowledge the great relationship we've had with the chair and the CRTC on these matters. We're always welcome in terms of providing input and discussion, and I think, again, very much appreciate Mr. Blais coming and joining us here today to share some of the things that are going on in his world, but also to have that access to our members and to the marketing community. So, again, very much appreciate the dialogue. So, my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Blais. Our honored guest and featured speaker this morning, Mr. Jean-Pierre Blais. He's Chairman and CEO of the CRTC. He's had a long and distinguished career with our federal government, having worked in progressively senior roles with the Treasury Board, the Department of Canadian Heritage, and the CRTC, where he was appointed Chairman and CEO in 2012. He holds a Master of Law from the University of Melbourne, as well as Bachelors of both Civil and Common Law from McGill University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chairman and CEO of the CRTC, Jean-Pierre Blais.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Before I start my speech, let me start with a short public service advertisement.
We live in a rapidly evolving digital world. You're using technology to work, play, and connect with each other. You spend a lot of time watching, listening, and consuming media. Technology has become essential in every part of our lives, from health to education, from safety to security, and to the strength of the economy. You deserve communications networks and services that you can count on. The CRTC plays an important role to make that a reality. We ensure that you have access to a world-class communication system, one with reliable and secure networks, and choice of affordable and high-quality services, whether you're living in Kuujjuaq, working in the prairies, or sitting in a cafe in Montreal. We protect you from unwanted calls and spam while ensuring businesses can continue to compete in the global marketplace. We ensure you can create and share your stories, whether on the radio, television, or over the internet. You can shape the future. Learn more about your CRTC at crtc.gc.ca.
So we created that video so that we, in a nutshell, could explain what we do. And just like you, like the marketers in this room, we saw the benefit of exploiting children as cute and cuddly to sell our products. So as I start my remarks, I would like to acknowledge that on behalf of all of us, they were gathered here this morning, and that we meet on the traditional territory of the First Nation peoples. I thank them and pay respect to their elders. So good morning. Good morning, fellow marketers. And I smile when I say that because I'm only half joking that when I place myself in your company, I've done my fair share of marketing during my tenure at the CRTC as chairman, promoting hearings, sharing findings, defending opinions, upholding rules. So I appreciate the sharp and sometimes contradictory views and emotions you're exposed to. One part of the general public celebrates you, another part scorns you, perhaps still another part treats you with indifference, the unkindest cut of all. Even those within the highest reaches of business often don't quite know what to make of you. David Hewlett, the co-founder of one of the most successful and transformative companies of the 20th century, believed marketing to be something too important to be left to those in his marketing department. A backhanded compliment if I've ever heard one. Ouch. At the opposite end of the spectrum is Edwin Land, co-founder of Polaroid, another of last century's breakthrough enterprises in science and business. He believed marketing to be the things you do only when you have a product that's no good. I guess his portrait isn't hanging on the walls back at the CMA headquarters either. I can assure you my admiration for legitimate marketing pros is unambiguous. Yours is tough work. It requires keen intelligence and deep humility. Not an easy combination to pull off. Intelligence to satisfy the Hewletts of the world, and humility to cope with the Lands. There seems to be not much middle ground of opinion. My colleagues and I at the CRTC can relate. We're praised for our efforts in helping Canadians regain control of their communication system. We're spurned as meddling functionaries who should be dispatched to the unemployment lines by others. I suspect some of those who see us as bureaucratic busybodies likely had no idea who I was and had little interest in the work of the CRTC until the laws and regulation to reduce spam emails and unsolicited telecommunications came along. Yet those who feel I'm your enemy are mistaken. I'm not even your adversary, and you're not mine. Sure, we've had our disagreements, especially when unsolicited telecommunication rules and Canada's anti-spam legislation were being discussed and put into effect. Your attitude as an organization has changed since, and the attitudes of many of you in this room, I'm sure, has also changed. I thank you for that change of heart. I thank you for your work, individually and as an organization, to make sure marketers comply with the law. And I thank you for your willingness to work with partners, with the CRTC, to make compliance so widespread among marketers. We must continue working together and on our own and together to give Canadians what they have asked for. They have asked you, legitimate marketers, to comply with the terms of the unsolicited telecommunication rules in Canada's anti-spam legislation. And through their elected representatives, they've asked the CRTC to enforce those rules and the law. So ladies and gentlemen, in the spirit of working towards the same goal, thank you for inviting me to join you this morning and share with you the CRTC's activities to enforce unsolicited telecommunication rules and Canada's anti-spam legislation, which I'll call CASL, as so many people do. Maybe I'll go off script here a little bit with this notion of CASL. When I was first appointed to the CRTC on June 18th, 2012, by the way, that's the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, I started getting briefings on the various responsibilities we had, and one of them was on CASL. And I was surprised that people were referring to the legislation as CASL. And the people briefing me, quietly and respectfully said, well, the problem was that when the Act was adopted in Parliament, it was a minority government, and they never agreed on a short title. Because the actual title of the legislation is an act to promote the efficiency and adaptability of the Canadian economy by regulating certain activities that discourage reliance on electronic means of carrying out commercial activities, and to amend the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Act, the Competition Act, the Personal Information Protection, Electronic Document Act, and the Telecommunications Act. That's 52 words. Nearly 400 characters. You can't even issue a tweet on this statute without finding a shorter title. So fair enough. I said, that's great. It's good you created your own short title. But then I said, well, why CASL? Why that C? And I said, we don't call it the Canadian Copyright Act. We don't call it the Canadian Broadcasting Act. We don't call it the Canadian Income Tax Act. And then there was a silence in the people briefing me, and one of them took courage and says, well, if you drop that C, sound it out. And we really don't want you to be the first chair responsible for ASL. So back to the speech. Ladies and gentlemen, why should we both be doing everything in our power to give Canadians what they have asked for? Because not only are CASL, with a C, and the unsolicited telecommunication rules here to stay, legitimate marketers also recognize the equally legitimate need for them. I respect the practices and appreciate the work of legitimate marketers. Emphasis here on legitimate. Responsible, creative marketers help consumers find the goods and services they need and desire, an essential service in the marketplace. The very best marketers persuade by using their smarts and wits to entertain and amuse, by appealing with seductive words and images, by convincing people to identify themselves through brands, and by taking creative and lawful advantage of the latest high-tech tools and tactics. I have no beef with legitimate marketers, just as I'm sure you, members of the Canadian Marketing Association, don't condone those marketers who break our country's laws, either willfully or through ignorance. And let's make no mistake, CASL is an act of Parliament. Our elected representatives put in place this law at the behest of Canadians themselves. I didn't create this law. It's not some edict issued by me with a flash of my pen. My colleagues and I at the CRTC were given a responsibility through Parliament to enforce these rules, this law of the land. And from what I can see, I can tell you, it's not going anywhere. They're very likely here to stay for a while. If anything, laws of this nature and rules of this nature will get tougher, not more lenient. And legitimate marketers should welcome them. They give you guidelines by which to ply your difficult trade, and they help us not get exposed to scammers whose practices diminish your profession in the eyes of Canadians, the very consumers they're trying to appeal to. Why else should we both be doing everything in our power to give Canadians what they've asked for? Because we need to appreciate today's consumers are different from those of a decade ago, let alone a generation past. Adoption of smartphones is widespread in Canada. These devices have changed our behavior radically. We use them to plan our lives, perform our jobs, connect with other citizens, communicate with our friends and members of our families, and explore a vast and growing world of people and experience that was unknown to us a decade ago. And we do all these things continually through our waking hours, even when we should be getting some sleep. Most of us would be lost without our smartphones. I'm actually a bit anxious because I left mine on the table over there. Or we would at least have to go through some sort of recovery program to get over the shock and distress of their loss. These devices have also changed our expectations. We Canadians consider our smartphones to be private spaces, like our homes, like our very selves. And just as we don't like it when strangers intrude into our personal spaces or show up on our doorsteps, we don't like it when unwanted messages and annoying calls enter the private spaces of our smartphones. Imagine how you'd feel if a stranger walked through your front door, tracked dirt across your kitchen floor, went to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and then plopped themselves down in front of your TV. That's pretty much how Canadians today feel about uninvited marketers who invade the private spaces of their smartphones. That's pretty much how Canadians feel about spam and unsolicited telecommunications. And that's why they demanded, and Parliament responded with Castle and the National Do Not Call List. Cause and effect. It's that simple. Why else should we both be doing everything in our power to give Canadians what they've asked for? Because compliance is better than enforcement. At the CRTC, our goal is to promote compliance with the law and prevent recidivism. It's not ultimately about enforcement. We don't go out looking for dragons to slay. We much prefer helping marketers comply with the law when enforcing it after they've broken it. And we back up that desire with action. CRTC staff crisscross the country, meeting with business owners and company executives and managers and marketing professionals to share with them the information and insight they need to be compliant with the law. Business people attend these sessions in great numbers, like you this morning, to learn about recent enforcement updates, and more so to ask questions to make sure their activities comply with the law. That's where the CMA as an organization comes in. Keep taking action to empower your members with information and insight that helps them comply with the laws and the rules. If you need help, get in touch with the CRTC. We want to help. We prefer to be your ally in ensuring compliance amongst your members, not your adversary when it comes time to enforce the law. Can we create a bright line test that separates right from wrong? No, we can't. The laws and rules are not prescriptive. We have discretion. If the do's and don'ts were cut and dry, a computer could enforce the law. Judgment and discretion are at play here. That said, we are building our capacity to gather and analyze information from complaints, the private sector, and honeypots. This intelligence helps us make decisions on which cases merit investigation. And as the month and years pass, our country is building case law around the application of Castle and the unsolicited telecommunication rules. In a 2014 speech to an audience at the Economic Club right here in Toronto, I explained how the new law and the rules would work. I also looked ahead to outline exactly how the CRTC would uphold them. And I assured you that we would focus on the most egregious instances of non-compliance. I'm happy to report that the CRTC is following through on what I promised. Here are a few examples. First, let's look at Canada's anti-spam legislation and the DorkBot botnet case. Yes, you heard me, DorkBot. In December, we served the first ever warrant under Castle to take down a command and control server located in Toronto. This warrant enabled us to enter a place of business that housed this server. The server was part of a network that controlled malware that had infected more than 1 million personal computers in some 190 countries. This malware was spread through USB flash drives, instant messaging programs, and social networks. Once a computer was compromised, it was instructed to steal passwords used for online banking and payments. It downloaded and installed dangerous malware, and it also joined other infected computers in sending multiple requests to a specific server in the hopes of overwhelming its capacity to respond, known as a distributed denial of service attack. Our effort to bring down this Toronto-based server was part of a coordinated international effort that involved allies from Canada and around the globe: the RCMP, the FBI, Europol, Interpol, Public Safety Canada, the Canadian Cyber Incident Response Centre, as well as Microsoft. Our takedown of this botnet is a perfect example of Canada's anti-spam legislation in action. The warrants we needed to break up this botnet is specifically outlined in the law. We couldn't have achieved the takedown as quickly and as completely as we did without it. The international effort we were part of was a direct result of enacting anti-spam legislation. The law made us part of a global alliance of nations and organizations not only committed to thwarting spammers and scammers, but also equipped to stop them. Now, I know you don't want your computer systems to be infected by botnets, let alone be part of a botnet scam. I know you don't want us to show up at your home or your place of business with a warrant. I know you, the legitimate marketers and telemarketers, don't really want to be that guy. So I urge you, I urge all marketers to comply with our country's anti-spam law. I invite you to be compliant. That's compliant with a C, with the anti-spam legislation, because you just don't want to be an asshole. Now, let's look at enforcement of Canada's rules against unsolicited telecommunications. Earlier this month, National Anti-Fraud Month, by the way, we issued notices of violation of 3 Canadian companies and 2 call centers based in India. Our notices state that these 5 telemarketing firms failed to respect the unsolicited telecommunication rules, and we have levied penalties against them totaling nearly $650,000. What did these companies do to warrant such a stiff reprimand? Our investigation, spurred by complaints filed by Canadians, found that these telemarketers made calls to Canadians whose phone numbers are registered on the National Do Not Call list. These telemarketers also made unsolicited calls without being registered with the National DNCL operator and without having brought a body subscription to the list. What makes the actions of these telemarketers even more brazen is that while they were acting, they were claiming to be and were trying to sell using these identities. They identified themselves as representatives of Microsoft or the Government of Canada or even US Homeland Security. And they were using the fraudulent authority of these disguises to peddle antivirus software. During some calls, these scam artists even asked to be given remote access to the homeowner's computer on the pretext of removing viruses and malicious softwares. And as we did in the Darkbot investigation, we used a warrant to enter and inspect a property used by one of the companies at its base of operations. We also relied on the support of our partners, in this case, the RCMP, the Peel Regional Police, the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, the Forensic Accounting Management Group of Public Service and Procurement Canada, the former Public Works, and national and local law enforcement officials in India. We couldn't have disrupted these operations as quickly and as effectively as we did without the rules and without the partnerships that these rules have made possible. I know you don't want us to show up at your home or place of business with a warrant. I know you don't want to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in penalties. I know you don't want to see your company's name splash over the news in this context. I know you really don't want to be that guy. So again, I urge you, all marketers, to comply with our country's unsolicited telecommunication rules. I also urge you to look ahead. Look ahead to the day when all your fellow marketers comply with the law. Look ahead to the day when all your fellow marketers are using the law to guide their actions. Don't be the ones left behind. Invest your time and attention to get your activities in compliance as soon as possible. I know you don't want to see your company's name in our next media release. I know you don't want to be the subject to a private right of action from a group of citizens that have been subjected to unlawful spam. I know you don't want to find yourself in court because the court won't provide you with guidance to comply, but we will. And that's my message to legitimate marketers. To the pros in this room, the ones who not only know the law is here to stay, but also know it separates their efforts from the scammers and the charlatans. Let's keep working together to make sure all marketers in Canada comply with the law. Let's continue to educate and inform members of your association. Let's expose the scam artists whose practices diminish your profession in the eyes of Canadians. Let's give Canadians what they've asked for, a marketing environment in this country that is free from unwanted intrusions. What's my message to the holdouts? To those who think the law and rules are a passing fad, to those who are still moaning and complaining about reasonable requirements developed at the instruction of Canadians, my message is this: it's time for them to get on side. To comply with the law, it's time to embrace what Canadians have demanded and change the ways in which they behave. As I know those in this room have done so already. I know because you don't want to be that guy who pleads ignorance of the law rather than the one who takes action to abide by it. I know because you want to make sure your marketing activities comply with the law before you carry them out rather than risk being forced in compliance after the fact. I know because you want to respect Canada's the private space of Canadians, whether in their homes or on their mobile devices. I know you are mindful of our friends Mr. Hewlett and Mr. Land. You will use intelligence and display humility as you continue to follow Castle and the unsolicited telemarketing rules. Thank you very much. The middle chair, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Chairman. And we're going to be joined for this part of the program by Lynn Perreault, who is one of the Chairman's Directors of Enforcement, specifically, in Lynn's case, for Castle. So welcome, Lynn.
She gets all the hard questions.
So, just to change it up a little bit,
sure.
I thought I'd ask you the broader question, I guess comes related to your mandate. Over the last year or two, I think most of the people in this room would be aware that a few organizations have challenged the CRTC on its jurisdiction in terms of online services. Historically, the Commission has had broad powers to regulate our telecommunications and media environment, though for many years your organization took a fairly light hand in terms of regulating the internet. Given that so much content is moving onto a largely user-controlled model for content consumption, are we inevitably moving toward a more deregulated online media environment?
I know people like to say the Commission doesn't regulate the internet, but that sort of brevity belongs on Twitter. It actually doesn't follow scrutiny of actually what we're doing. Let's look at it. On telecommunications, it's true that for the most part, our actions with respect to the internet operates at the wholesale level, not at the retail level. And so even recently, just last summer, we looked at wireline competition and tried to set the terms and conditions to ensure that competitors could have access to the networks of incumbent telecommunication providers so that there would be a dynamic marketplace, including fiber to the premises and mandated access to that. So, but our operations on the telecom side is actually, there are tariffs on the wholesale side. We're actually quite active. And for the most part, as I mentioned, it is on the wholesale side. There's a few exceptions, most notably in Northwest Territory, where we decided to re-regulate retail tariffs because competition was not actually providing people in those communities, in certain communities, with a competitive model, because we do prefer to use competition to achieve our objectives. On the broadcasting side, you know, often people talk about this unregulated internet content providers. And I made a comment in a hearing once, and people reacted. I think what I was saying was actually quite orthodox. The Broadcasting Act defines quite broadly what is broadcasting, and it includes audiovisual content that's distributed through the internet. But the Act says to the Commission, so Parliament, that we must exempt certain undertakings that otherwise are carrying on broadcasting undertakings from the obligation to hold a license. It doesn't say don't regulate them. In fact, it says you must adopt an exemption order, which, by the way, is a form of regulation. So that's what the Commission has done on a number of occasions, because we came to the conclusion, based on the facts, it is a factual question, that the content that is, for instance, streamed online is much complementary to what is occurring on the more traditional licensed broadcasting services. That's something that gets to be revisited every so often. But it's false to say the Commission is not involved with internet content. We have just chosen a regulatory path of exemption as opposed to licensing. And certainly with CASL and the other rules that I discussed earlier, communications is more and more about internet-based delivery, from IP telephony to IP content. And just because the technology has changed, in fact, most of the legislation has been drafted in a technologically neutral way. It's actually quite brilliantly drafted in the early 90s to foresee this technological change, has allowed us to adapt to the new circumstances. So for those people that say that we don't regulate the internet, well, if you want to say that, say it on Twitter, but if you want the full answer, it takes the time I just took.
Thank you. So back to CASL, and maybe just to talk a little bit about CASL's effectiveness, because I think that's of interest to everyone in this room. I mean, it was certainly the biggest regulatory change for the marketing community since the National Do Not Call List, maybe even since PIPEDA went into force 14 years ago. And organizations in this room and elsewhere made significant investments in systems and process changes, training to ensure compliance. We're hearing from some business groups that they question whether it's had that much impact on spam rates or made a major difference for Canadian consumers. Does the Commission have any encouraging data that would help reassure that CASL is working? And can you tell us maybe a little bit about the measures you're using to track how CASL is stacking up in terms of reaching its goals?
Right. It's difficult when you're in this area because there's no control group to figure out, okay, what would the normal case be if you didn't have these legislations in place, how many calls get through? I spoke in Toronto a year and a half ago, and I gave the example on the Do Not Call list. Even though we have evidence that there's maybe 11 million calls, unauthorized calls, that wouldn't have gone through to ultimate Canadians, telemarketing they didn't want because they were on the Do Not Call list. You just get one, and you lose faith that the system works. So it's rather difficult here. And we know just before CASL came into force, there was a flood of emails. We probably all received them. I got like 10 to 14 a day in that last month before the 1st of July, where people were trying to get consent, and it was a busy time. So here are and it's limited, but here are two indices, I think, to me, that shows that it's still working. First of all, Canadians continue to report spam to the Spam Reporting Centre in large numbers, which suggests to me that they still are concerned about it, but they also trust the efficacy of our work. Now, to be clear, when you phone your municipal bylaw officer and complain about your neighbor's fence because it's a few inches too tall, whatever, there will be an officer that will come down and deal with your individual complaint. The number, we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of complaints or contacts we receive. You can't actually deal with them on an individual basis by sending a person to go into it. But what we do is we use large metric information, traffic patterns, honeypots to go into this. And I think Canadians are starting to realize, although they may not get through their action, individual action, globally, they know that we are doing enforcement. And we were quite heartened to see a US study recently by Cloudmark that indicated that in Canada, there was after the July coming into force of CASL in 2014, there was a 37% reduction of the amount of of spam in the Canadian marketplace. So that to me suggests, Canadians keep being active, complaining. That suggests there's still some spam, but not always. Some of it is actually authorized. And the fact that we have overall numbers that are going down seems to help. And over time, companies like the ones you in this room are coming on board, because they realize that if we want to have a competitive digital economy competing with other countries, you have to have an environment that is secure, that people trust. We're actually lagging behind other countries in terms of the amount of online business we do. And it's in all our interests, taxpayers, consumers, citizens, creators, to make sure we create an environment that is secure in the online world. And we keep doing that. And I think that it's still early days, and we'll just continue doing that and monitoring our efficacies.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly from my perspective, going after the bad guys is an important exercise. You were talking about the recent telemarketing announcement. My household had received a call from those guys, masquerading as Microsoft, and my spouse didn't know what to make of it. It's really easy to victimize people with that kind of activity, and so your organization is doing important work. In terms of some of the stats that you're mentioning, I think this room would be interested in knowing as well that eMarketer just published a study that shows that email marketing is up substantially in 2015 over 2014, virtually up 15%, mm-hmm. which one of the biggest jumps in recent years, which shows that marketers are confident that email marketing is working, and we need a positive environment for that to take place. Still on Castle.
But I'm like everyone else. I mean, there are trusted brands out there that I've bought things from. I actually want them to tell me when they've got specials. And as long as I have that trust relationship, that's great. And there are ways to do it, and it can be quite positive. And I think there's a generational issue where most people are doing some of their Christmas shopping online. That a lot of people find the convenience of doing this as excellent. Maybe one day we'll have delivery systems that presume you're not unemployed and that you're not at home between 9 and 5, so you can actually receive the goods and products safely. But that's we're moving on that, I guess, eventually. But it is a fundamental change, and I think there's a generational change where you don't go to big stores anymore. You pre-select, and that's having a huge disruptive impact on the retail sector. Hence the importance. And sorry, TD, I know you're a sponsor of this event, but I was chuckling the other day when I saw the BMO ad where, it wasn't a robocall, it was actually a live person, and they were making a joke about that, which, it shows that people are aware that if you care about your person you're trying to sell or continue to sell goods and services to, you've got to treat them in a trusted way. And sometimes that means live calls, and sometimes it's emails. But they have to have a feeling that whoever's at the other end of the line is a trusted source. So your role is important in making sure that that is the case.
We're approaching 2 years since Castle took effect. I'm wondering if you can share with the room some sense of the Commission's key enforcement priorities for Castle. And also, I think everyone would be interested to know if you'll be issuing any more enforcement guidance in the near future.
We will, if on the second question, we will if it's required. Maybe Lynn can add to that. Certainly, what we've realized, because there's massive volumes of people reaching out to us with concerns and complaints, that we've triaged. And we're seeing patterns, and we subdivide economic activity within, and we know that there are areas that are worse than others, and we've targeted them specifically. So, because we can't run after everything all at once. So there were areas, and honeypots are a way for us as well to to use technology. It's quite interesting. You'll never see this because we won't let you in, but we have a high-tech lab in which, if you go in, we can see patterns of traffic across telecommunications, for instance, and we have some partners at Concordia and elsewhere, and the telcos themselves that have provided us some numbers that we use for honeypots. So, it's 2 years is early days for Castle. We are building on the do not call experience as a base, because enforcement is enforcement, compliance is compliance, whether it's in any domain of activity. It just happens to be in the communications field here. But we really are trying to focus and triage on specific areas of the economy which are the most troublesome. And there are a few where we've actually taken action. And we're very public when we do it, because I think it's to your advantage that we come public when we go after the bad guys. I don't know, Lynn, if you have anything to add on that?
Yeah. Well, our recent sessions that we did out in Toronto, I know were well received, and we're making an effort to provide far more guidance on areas that are now perhaps a little bit less clear, and based on now a year and a half of enforcement, we're recognizing there may be some confusion. And so we are really inviting questions that are perhaps maybe a little bit more case specific. We're seeing some themes. Again, we are grouping them by themes, and then we know that there are some areas with regards to, say, unknown third party, which is a concept that's included in the GIC regulations that is of concern and needs some clarity. So we should be coming out with some guidance on that. Other FAQs are going to be crafted based on some of the questions that we're receiving post those particular sessions as well. And I wouldn't feel too insulted about not being invited into the lab. We even make the chair ring the doorbell to come in. So
it's, when you look at all this, and I think it is a partnership, a joint effort between all of us, there's some things that evolve, ideas, because you're a creative group, that you're trying to find new ways, and you need some, I'm not sure we'll be able to ever provide absolute certainty, but I think the compliance team rather have somebody who at least asked and tried than somebody who completely ignored us. Mm-hmm. So it's all to your advantage to come and see us. I should explain that, there is sort of a wall between the enforcement team and myself, because I end up, although I'm the CEO of the organization, I'm also one of the deciders. It's quite unique, and so the commissioners are not involved in the day-to-day enforcement. The staff does that, and that's why the guidance we get is that they provide is not necessarily binding on the commissioners, but it's not something we take lightly. We certainly respect the opinions of staff.
Yeah. And the work that the enforcement team does in terms of outreach, I think, is very helpful. Lynn and Dana Lynn Wood were in Toronto just a month or so back, and I got a lot of good feedback from our members who participated in that webinar in terms of the helpful information that is beginning to come out, as you've indicated. Yeah. That experience is starting to show, so that was positive. Still on Castle, but a little bit, I guess, up the food chain in terms of the legislation itself. I'm wondering how you anticipate the new private right of action provisions of Castle will impact enforcement and more generally electronic commerce in Canada. There's a lot of interest in that particular provision. I think it's fair to say concern in that it would be an entirely new dynamic, and business organizations, I think the marketing community are wondering whether it's really necessary, and I think have articulated that to government. But there's a new government in Ottawa, and who knows what they'll do. But I think this group would be interested in knowing.
I didn't see anything about this in the mandate letters, which are very published. So.
Yeah. So I think people would be interested in knowing what you might be hearing about it, or if you expect there may be changes to Castle either in the legislation or through regulations in relation to that particular provision.
I have no evidence one way or the other on this, other than mentioning the mandate letters, which I think from what I've seen the early days of this government, seems to be quite true to focusing on those priorities as opposed to new priorities, which is a bit of a challenge for anybody who has a priority who's not on that list. I appreciate that. You know, when the private right of action comes, it's out of our hands. And we've seen the States in the environmental sector, the private rights of actions can be quite considerable. So I understand why people would be nervous, but I think my message to you is I can't imagine a court not being swayed quite significantly if faced with a private right of action, you can point to guidance provided by the Commission, information, compliance policies that you have internally that receive the approval, not the approval, it's not like we're going to be approving these things, but that is compliant with the spirit and letter of the legislation. So that's what I was saying in my speech. You know, once there's a private right of action, I won't be able to help you. None of the staff will be able to help you. You're on your own. Good luck with that. And it'll cost a lot. There'll be a lot of lawyers, and there's reputational harm and all that. So all the more reason to get into compliance as much as you can with us, because I think it will diminish the risk. Will it remove the risk entirely? Perhaps not. There will be advocacy groups that, for whatever reason, will want to go out there, like they do now for collective actions, group actions that they do to classes of representing classes of aggrieved Canadians in the civil courts. So it'll be more of that. But you have every interest, I think, to join us ahead of that coming into force.
And the 3-year review is coming up in July 2017, and that again falls to the responsibility of ISED, formerly Industry Canada. And I'm sure there'd be opportunity there for comment, and they are the ones responsible for the drafting of the legislation. So, and until we hear differently in terms of any of those changes that are suggested as a result of the 3-year review, should there be any, for us, in terms of our enforcement actions, it'll be a business as usual until we hear differently.
Yep.
So
definitely, the policy center for this is the former Department of Industry Canada. Somebody who's been in government since the mid-'80s. I'm having a lot of difficulty with these name changes.
Well, I said.
Yeah. Innovation Canada.
Yeah, that would have been a nice, better marketing title, wouldn't it?
Yeah, short, sweet.
Just one last question for me before we open it up, and Lynn, this may be something that you can elaborate on a little bit. It concerns market research. You know, market research is very important, clearly, to the marketing community, and under CASL, there's certain exemptions for market research under CASL, but there's some uncertainty around the use of incentives to ensure that response rates for market research are adequate. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on how marketers should view this particular area of concern. I saw that the Commission put out a decision yesterday on the telemarketing side. I know it may be a little different on the CASL side. I was relieved to see on the telemarketing side that it seemed that incentives that are clearly separate and apart from trying to promote any sort of a business or service would be acceptable, and organizations need to be very careful in that regard. But can you talk to this issue under CASL and what organizations should be watching for there?
Well, as you just pointed out, I mean, under the UTR's unsolicited telecommunication rules, they speak directly to surveys, whereas in CASL it's silent on that area. Now, as part of our outreach, we have heard that concern about, including coupons or other types of incentives to participate in that survey. So really the first question you have to ask yourself is in fact your email that you're sending out commercial electronic messages or a commercial purpose to this, or is it really in fact If I can borrow some language from a couple of exemptions in the GIC, what is its primary purpose? So I know that this is of concern. We are looking at this right now, and we will come out with some guidance in this area shortly. So, are you inciting somebody into a commercial activity? If that's the case, then it is likely a CEM. If in fact it is predominantly for a survey messaging that you're sending out, then likely CASL does not apply.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to
we saw some instances in the States where people, because if you were doing a survey, there was a certain amount of protection for you, but they were doing fake surveys to pass through. And look, we know that in every 10 words in legislation, there's probably a loophole, and some clever people were using it. So we have to be careful as well that Lynn's notion of primary purpose, I know it's not black and white, it's not clear, it's evidence-based, but I think that is something that should be a guidepost.
Thank you. So let's open it up to questions from you folks in the audience. We have some microphones. People with microphones, just throw up your hand, and it will be brought over to you. I think we have one underway here. Great. Thank you, Marcia.
Hi. I've worked on CASL since before it was in force, about a year and a half before that, and I'm intimately aware of CASL and how CASL works for Canadians. What we're finding is, because we're a global organization, we are playing the legislations against each other. CAN-SPAM, TCPA, CASL, and I just want to know, do you talk to your cohorts across the borders at all about their laws that may marry up to and sometimes be different from ours?
Yeah. Let Lynn discuss. The policy center from this, as I mentioned earlier, is not so much, we're the enforcement compliance side of things. And certainly on that side, under both regimes, we're very active working with some colleagues, major partners in the UK and the Netherlands and Australia and New Zealand. I do think that there is, because it's so new, there's lack of coordination, full coordination at the international level on many of these electronic commerce issues. I'm actually quite happy to see that at the OECD, there's actually a growing interest in making sure these electronic commerce related issues do have coordination. But as it is a new area, we're seeing that there's a lot more history for automobiles and lumber and all the physical issues around the world, and the emerging reality of digital commerce and digital activities has not quite occupied the international coordinating field. But we won't be able to avoid it. Canada's been a leader. We held one of the first meetings in Ottawa on the Information Society. We were quite active in Seoul, a few years after that, and there's an upcoming ministers of in this area OECD meeting in June, which I think, again, e-commerce will have to be raised. It has to be dealt with because it's borderless. It reminds me a lot in the 19th century when copyright was very much a domestic issue, and so people would go off to London and take down the latest Gilbert and Sullivan operetta and take the boat across the ocean and produce it in New York without paying the original authors, until people realized, wait a minute, we need it. And that was the origin of the Berne Convention, because they realized that although with communications, boats then, planes, now instantaneous telecommunication, events don't occur in just one place, and we have to have some coordination. And informally, regulators meet to exchange on these ideas. So I understand, but I think it's an evolution thing. We're not quite there yet.
And from an operational perspective, absolutely. I mean, if you're familiar with CASL, you know that there are provisions that allow us to share information, assist in terms of some of the investigative tools that are authorized to us under the legislation. And that was recently evidenced by the international effort on the Win32 Dorkbot takedown. And that was truly a first for us. I mean, we had done some work in the past with our counterparts south of the border and some of the other national law enforcement agencies, but this was really the first where we were part of a global effort, and it was a very exciting and a very challenging experience. So we're looking forward to doing more of that.
Not with you folks.
No.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I'm from BMO, so thank you for mentioning our commercial. My question, I'm on the social media team, and I think in general, Castle's pretty straightforward when it comes to email and telephone communications, but where there's a little ambiguity is how it applies to social media, because it's a little different. Can we @mention someone who hasn't @mentioned us, for example? Can you talk about the conversations that you've had and how Castle might apply to social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we understand the ambiguity there because of all of the different platforms and apps and so forth. And so we are working to understand, how that would apply in the evolving landscape. Understand that we look at what is defined as electronic address. So basically, if the messaging is being provided to an individual in particular or at a e-address in particular, then Castle would apply. If it's broadcast, and I don't mean broadcast under the traditional broadcast sense, the other side of the house as we call it, but broadcast to many, say posting on a wall of some sort, if I can borrow against Facebook's theme, then that does not apply. So unfortunately it's almost on a case-by-case basis, but we are looking at providing more guidance in that area because this is a recurring theme. Castle was meant to be technology neutral, so that it could respond to these new developments. So more guidance on that, but what we would welcome from you to help us in terms of providing guidance that matters to you is send us the problem space that you're seeing or the concerns that you have. It allows us to address what we can head on.
Another question over here.
Thank you. You've outlined really clearly how marketers, we have a lot of skin in the game now. And you've also outlined how a lot of our enterprise partners have put investments and resources in order to be compliant. Most of the businesses in Canada are small ones, though, that don't have the same resources, tools, capabilities, money, time, people to be as compliant and aware. What resources, what tools, what guidance do you have for the small business who, especially with private right of actions, have the same skin in the game? A one-person operation with a $1,000 budget could still get sued to the same end.
Yep. Well, how
are you supporting?
This Castle is not prescriptive, and based on the investigations that are undertaken, as we said, we take them on a case-by-case basis. So we will recognize the fact that perhaps you're a smaller organization, and so we put out compliance programs in terms of the guidance material that is there. Adapt what works for you. So each thing is each instance is on a case-by-case basis. So we're not requiring you to have huge systems in place to track. I mean, it's up to you to determine for yourself what works in terms of tracking your consent. Remember that consent is, the onus is on you to prove consent. So how are you going to do that? So if you are leveraging implied consent, say from conspicuous publication, just track how you obtained and where and when you obtained that particular email address and indicate that there wasn't a statement to the contrary, not wanting to receive CEM. Track it in an Excel spreadsheet if that's the case you want to use. So not compliant, adapt it to your particular situation, and we certainly would look at that.
It's not the first time that small business face issues of new regulations or even old regulations that they may not be able, because of their smaller size to meet with. And like every business person, what one does is do a risk assessment. Unless you're tremendously successful with a very small company, the likelihood of you getting on the attention radar of anybody wanting to do a private right of action is, of course, inversely proportional in a certain sense. I know it's theoretically possible, but it's less likely. And I think that people who might be out there thinking of wanting to use the private right of action would be ill-advised to start by going after a small independent player. I know the theory is there, and I don't want to minimize your concern, but I do think that there is a risk assessment to be made there, and it's not a cookie-cutter approach. The impact a large multinational company will have is much greater than a small local player that might not have a huge footprint in the marketplace. And certainly when we work, we have that. Now, there are small businesses that are very unlawful, however, so we will go after them. But that's not our primary purpose.
You know, and our response will be appropriate and measured as well. I mean, we have a compliance continuum in terms of the tools that we can choose from warning letters, you know, through to the notice of violation, if you will.
That's a reactive response, though?
Correct.
The question was about how can we better be proactive, which I guess you've outlined to say it's kind of up to you.
Well, I was going to just jump in and suggest that you know, CMA members do have access to some pretty comprehensive information on our site in terms of our Castle Guide and related materials. We gather not only, you know, our own materials, but materials such as I mentioned the Commission doing a webinar with us 3 or 4 weeks ago. That material's on the site. So there is, for businesses involved with the CMA, there's a wealth of information on the site to at least get you started. I mean, we don't and can't address every you know, specific situation, but we've tried to give pretty good guidance to our members. So there's that, and I think as the Commission moves forward, we'll see more available from them. I think we've got time for another 1 or 2 questions. Who's got their one over here?
Thanks. So on the same theme as the private right of action, when it comes into effect July of next year, has it been decided if the cases will allow to be retroactive, or will it be cases from July 1st moving forward?
No, it has not been decided. That is something I suspect the courts will decide, and I know that ISED, Industry Canada, is looking at that, and that they're contemplating that. But I think that's been their answer to date, that the courts will decide.
Yes, although that was an issue raised sort of in the final days of Castle being passed, and we had written to the government, and the legal opinions that they have, for what those would be worth, are that it will not apply retroactively. But the fact is, there is that risk. I mean, Lynn's correct in indicating that at the end of the day, it may be a court that ends up deciding that particular issue, which is unfortunate. But certainly, I guess the advice that we've received in response to the concerns expressed is that it's not likely to be applied retroactively. So, time for perhaps one more question, if there is another question. We've got the chairman here, and Lynn. No? Oh, okay. David, one last question here.
Sounded like you really wanted another question. Just sort of, I guess, little guidance, or not guidance, maybe information. You've spoken about the experience enforcement to date and your priorities. 2 out of the 4 cases decided, or let's say notices of violation issued, 3 of which have been settled. 2 out of 4 involved mainstream companies, not spammers. In fact, you could argue 3 out of the 4 really are sort of, let's say, reasonable businesses, not spammers. 1, maybe I'm mischaracterizing them all, but But that's been the evidence. I'm aware, I believe, that you're working on a lot of cases that involve more disreputable activities than were evidenced in those cases. Can you give us any indication of, A, the type of cases you're working on, and B, whether, I mean, have there been any decided determinations on those cases, or are you going to give us some evidence of the activity against, let's call them, real spammers?
Well, before I let Lynn answer, I think it's important. We don't have a lens that starts off by saying, are people reputable or disreputable? All we have is the law. I mean, it may be your judgment that somebody is reputable, but we have reputable companies that don't do their payroll deductions at source, right? There are rules of all kinds. So that's not how we look at it. I understand your perspective, and the short speech only allowed me to highlight a few areas, and some of them, as I say, as Lynn mentioned, are dealt with warning letters that may not have attracted as much media coverage. But she can add.
Yeah. So remember that when the law came into force in July of 2014, Section 8, which deals with the malware and the botnets and some of the more technically egregious activity, did not come into force until January 2015. So initially our focus was on spam, if you will, and altering transmission data, you know, those types of cases that we were able to turn our attention to. The length of an investigation obviously varies from case to case depending on its complexity. And so those initial cases that came out, of course, were focused on Section 6, and they were prioritized as a result of what we were seeing, what Canadians were complaining about in the Spam Reporting Centre. So we're getting 5,000 to 6,000 complaints or submissions, if you will, a week in the Spam Reporting Centre. So we have to automate you know, how we identify cases and clustering of data from the Spam Reporting Centre. And those were ones that were identified to us. When January rolled around, we were then able to turn our attention to cases like DorkBot, and if you were cognizant of a press release that came out in January, we have another malware case that we're working on right now and working, you know, on an international scale on that one as well. We served a warrant in the St. Catharines area. So we are focusing now on, you know, malware type cases, botnet type cases, but that does not mean that we are not going to focus on, you know, spam cases as well. So as the chair rightly pointed out, our lens is, you know, what are Canadians complaining about? What are we seeing as truly malicious activity? And so we want to apply our resources, limited as they are, to those particular areas.
Thank you, Lynn. So if there's one takeaway, Castle's here to stay, and compliance is extremely important. If any of you had missed that prior to our getting together, let me thank the chairman and Lynn for joining us this morning and for an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.